It was 7:43 in the morning on April 27th, 1945, and the war was almost over. Private Michael Sullivan from Toronto stood in the ruins of what had been a bakery in the small German town of Leer, watching smoke rise from burning buildings 3 streets away. The 3rd Canadian Infantry Division had taken the town 2 days earlier after brief but intense fighting. Now came the harder part, the occupation, the sorting through rubble looking for holdout soldiers, the processing of civilians who emerged from basements like ghosts rising from graves. Sullivan was 22 years old and had been fighting since Normandy. He was tired in ways that went beyond physical exhaustion, tired in his bones and his soul, tired of war and death and the endless gray sameness of destroyed towns that all looked identical after a while. He heard her before he saw her, a woman's voice speaking German, the words rushing together in desperate pleading. Sullivan turned and saw her standing in the doorway of a partially collapsed building across the street. She was maybe 40 years old, though it was hard to tell, because starvation and stress aged people in ways that made estimation impossible. Her dress was dirty and torn. Her hair hung in greasy strands around her face, but it was her eyes that struck Sullivan most, eyes that held a particular kind of desperation that he'd seen before in people who'd reached the absolute limit of their endurance. She stepped into the street, hands raised to show she was unarmed, and began walking toward him. Behind her, partially hidden in the doorway, Sullivan could see children. 3 of them, small shapes pressed against the wall, watching their mother approach the enemy soldier with the kind of stillness that comes from fear. The woman kept talking in German as she walked, her voice shaking, tears running down her cheeks. Sullivan didn't speak German beyond a handful of words he'd picked up during the campaign, but he didn't need translation to understand what she was asking for. Her hands made eating motions. She pointed back at her children. She was begging for food. Sullivan's immediate instinct was to help. He'd been raised by his mother after his father died in a mill accident when Sullivan was 8. His mother had struggled to feed him and his 3 younger siblings during the Depression, stretching every penny, going hungry herself so her children could eat. He'd seen that same look in his mother's eyes that he now saw in this German woman's eyes, the look of a parent willing to do absolutely anything to keep their children alive. But Sullivan's training and his orders complicated that instinct. Non-fraternization was the rule. Don't help civilians. Don't give them supplies. Don't treat them as friends or victims. They're Germans. They supported Hitler. They deserve what they get. The woman had stopped perhaps 10 feet away from him, close enough that Sullivan could see she was trembling, close enough to see the dirt under her fingernails and the hollowness in her cheeks that marked severe malnutrition. She'd stopped talking and was just standing there looking at him with those desperate eyes, waiting to see if this young foreign soldier in his clean uniform would help or turn away. Sullivan could feel the weight of the decision pressing on him. This moment, this choice, it mattered in ways that went beyond military regulations or political ideology. This was a human being asking another human being for help. Everything else was noise. Sullivan reached into his pack and pulled out his ration tin. It was supposed to be his lunch, canned meat and crackers, not much but enough to keep a soldier going through a day of patrols and guard duty. He held it out toward the woman. She stared at the tin like it was a miracle, like she couldn't quite believe what she was seeing. Then she lunged forward and grabbed it from his hand, clutching it to her chest with both arms, sobbing now with what sounded like relief and gratitude mixed together. She started talking rapidly in German again, the words tumbling out, probably thank you repeated over and over, though Sullivan couldn't be sure. But Sullivan wasn't finished. He'd seen the children in the doorway. 1 tin of food wasn't going to be enough for a mother and 3 kids. He reached into his pack again and pulled out everything edible he had. 2 more ration tins, a chocolate bar, some biscuits, an apple he'd been saving. He stacked them in the woman's arms until she could barely hold everything. Her sobbing had intensified, her whole body shaking, tears streaming down her face as she tried to speak, but couldn't form coherent words anymore. Then, Sullivan did something that would have gotten him in serious trouble if his sergeant had seen it. He followed the woman across the street to the partially collapsed building where her children waited. He wanted to see where they were living, wanted to make sure they had shelter and water, wanted to do whatever else he could to help. The woman seemed confused by this, uncertain whether to be grateful or afraid that he was following her, but she let him inside anyway because she had no real choice, and because his arms were full of additional supplies he'd grabbed from a nearby supply depot. The building had been some kind of shop before the war, maybe a tailor or seamstress, based on the ancient sewing machine lying broken in the corner. The front was heavily damaged, but the back room had survived mostly intact. The woman and her children had been living there for over a week since the fighting started, and they'd fled their apartment building, which had taken a direct hit from artillery. The back room was maybe 12 feet by 12 feet, lit only by light coming through cracks in the damaged roof. There was a mattress on the floor where presumably all four of them slept huddled together. Some scattered possessions, a few clothes, a broken doll, a cooking pot. No running water, no heat, no sanitation beyond what Sullivan assumed was a bucket in the corner. The three children pressed against the far wall as Sullivan entered, staring at him with wide eyes that held terror barely controlled. The oldest was maybe 10 years old, a girl with blonde hair cut short and rough, wearing a dress that had probably fit her properly 6 months ago, but now hung loose on her thin frame. The middle child was a boy about 7, wearing shorts and a sweater both several sizes too small. The youngest was another girl, perhaps 4 years old, clutching a stuffed rabbit that had seen better days, her thumb in her mouth. All three children looked severely malnourished, their faces gaunt, their arms stick-thin, their eyes sunken. Sullivan felt something twist in his chest. These were just kids. They hadn't started the war. They hadn't voted for Hitler or built the camps or invaded Poland. They were just kids who'd been born in the wrong country at the wrong time and were now starving because of decisions made by adults they'd never met. Sullivan set down the supplies he'd carried from the depot, additional ration tins he'd grabbed when no one was looking, some canned vegetables, a blanket. The mother had opened one of the tins he'd given her and was using her fingers to scoop out the meat, giving it to her children who ate with the desperate speed of people who didn't know when they'd eat again. Sullivan watched them for a moment, then turned to leave. He'd done what he could, more than he was supposed to do. He needed to get back to his unit before someone noticed his absence, but the mother grabbed his arm as he turned toward the door. She pulled him back and pointed insistently at the wall where a photograph hung crookedly in a damaged frame. Sullivan stepped closer to look at it. The photo showed this same woman, younger and healthier, standing next to a man in a German army uniform. Between them stood the three children, all smaller versions of their current selves. A family portrait from before the war destroyed everything. The mother was pointing at the man in the photo and saying something in German, the same phrase repeated over and over with increasing urgency. Sullivan didn't understand the words, but he understood the meaning. This was her husband. He was gone. Dead, probably, killed on some battlefield in Russia or France or Italy, one more casualty in a war that had consumed millions. The woman was trying to tell Sullivan her story, trying to make him understand that she wasn't a Nazi or a monster, just a mother whose husband had been taken by the army and who was now trying to keep her children alive in a country that was collapsing around her. Sullivan nodded to show he understood, even though he couldn't speak her language and she couldn't speak his. Some things didn't need translation. Loss and grief and desperation, these were universal languages that transcended words. Sullivan left the building and walked back to where his squad was gathering for morning patrol. His sergeant, a tough Newfoundlander named Tom Walsh, looked at him suspiciously. "Where have you been, Sullivan?" "Just checking the perimeter, Sarge." Walsh didn't look convinced, but he didn't push it. They had a patrol to run, a sector to sweep for German holdouts. The conversation about Sullivan's whereabouts could wait, but Sullivan couldn't stop thinking about the woman and her children as he walked patrol through the destroyed streets of Leer. He'd given them food for maybe 2 days, 3 if they stretched it. Then what? They'd be starving again. There were thousands of German civilians in similar situations across every town the Canadians had captured. The official policy was to let German authorities handle civilian relief, but there were no German authorities anymore. The Nazi government had collapsed. Local officials had fled or been arrested. There was no system in place to feed or care for these people. They were on their own, and without help from the occupying forces, many of them were going to die. That night, Sullivan talked to some of the other guys in his platoon about what he'd seen. He described the mother and her 3 starving children living in the ruins of a shop. Some of the soldiers were unsympathetic. "They're Germans," one said. "Let them starve. They didn't care when our guys were dying on the beaches. Why should we care about them now?" But others felt differently. A soldier named Peter Chen from Vancouver said his own parents had faced discrimination and hardship in Canada, had been treated as enemy aliens even though they were loyal Canadians. He understood what it was like to be judged for who you were rather than what you'd done. "If there are kids starving," he said, "we should help. Kids didn't start this war." The discussion continued in quiet voices after lights out, soldiers lying in their bedrolls debating morality and duty and what they owed to enemy civilians. No consensus emerged, but something shifted in the group dynamic. Several soldiers admitted they'd also given food to German civilians, despite the non-fraternization orders. One had helped an old man who'd fallen in the street. Another had left ration tins on the doorstep of a house where he'd heard children crying inside. These weren't official actions or organized charity. They were individual choices made by individual soldiers who saw human suffering and decided that being decent mattered more than following rules that felt wrong. Sullivan went back to the damaged shop the next morning. He brought more food, supplies he'd scrounged from various sources. The Canadian Army had logistics that the Wehrmacht could only dream of. There was always extra food, surplus supplies, equipment that wouldn't be missed. Sullivan had learned how to navigate the system, how to acquire things without attracting attention, skills that peacetime Sullivan working in his uncle's hardware store had never needed but that wartime Sullivan had mastered. The mother recognized him when he appeared in the doorway. Her face lit up with something that might have been hope or relief or just recognition that this particular soldier was safe, that he meant her family no harm. The children were less afraid this time, watching him from the mattress rather than pressed against the far wall. Sullivan set down the supplies and did something that surprised even himself. He sat down on the floor, pulled out his own ration tin, and ate lunch with this German family in their ruined shelter. They couldn't talk, not really. She spoke German, he spoke English, but somehow they communicated anyway through gestures and facial expressions and the shared human experience of eating together. The mother told him her name through repetition and pointing at herself. Margaret. Sullivan pointed at himself. Michael. She repeated it with a heavy accent. Mikhail. Close enough. The children's names. Followed. Anna, the oldest. Heinrich, the middle boy. Little Greta with her stuffed rabbit. Sullivan showed them photographs from his wallet, pictures of his own family back in Toronto, his mother and siblings, his girlfriend Mary, a snap of his old dog. The universal language of family photographs bridged the gap between enemy and enemy. This became a pattern over the following days. Sullivan would find excuses during patrols to swing by the damaged shop. He'd bring food, blankets, whatever he could carry without attracting too much attention. He fixed the roof using scavenged materials, patching the worst holes so rain wouldn't pour directly onto the mattress. He brought candles for light and a small camping stove with fuel so Margaret could heat food. These were small gestures in the grand scheme of war and occupation, but they made an enormous difference to one family trying to survive in a destroyed world. Other soldiers in Sullivan's platoon started doing similar things. It was never discussed openly or organized officially, but word spread quietly through the unit that helping German civilians who were obviously suffering wasn't going to be punished as long as it was done discreetly. Sergeant Walsh, who'd seemed suspicious of Sullivan's activities, turned out to be leaving food parcels at an orphanage on the edge of town. The hard-bitten sergeant from Newfoundland couldn't stand watching children starve, regardless of what flag flew over the building. His attitude gave other soldiers permission to follow their instincts toward mercy rather than adherence to rules that seemed increasingly pointless as the war wound down. Sullivan learned fragments of Margaret's story through patient communication spread across many visits. Her husband Carl had been a schoolteacher before the war, conscripted in 1941, sent to fight in Russia. He'd died during the retreat from Stalingrad in the winter of 1943, frozen to death in a trench, somewhere in Ukraine. Margaret had raised her children alone through the final 2 years of the war, through the bombing raids and the food shortages and the slow collapse of German society. She'd kept them alive through resourcefulness and determination and the kind of desperate ingenuity that mothers develop when their children's survival depends on it. Now, with Germany occupied and her country in ruins, she was trying to figure out how to continue surviving in a world that had become even more precarious. Sullivan asked his sergeant what was going to happen to German civilians once the occupation became permanent. Walsh shrugged. "That's above my pay grade," he said. "I heard the British and Americans are setting up some kind of relief program, food distribution, medical care, that kind of thing. But it's going to take time to get organized, and until then, people are on their own." "How many are going to starve while we're getting organized?" Sullivan asked. Walsh looked at him with an expression that mixed sympathy with resignation. "Too many," he said. "Way too many." The scale of the crisis was becoming apparent as the Canadians settled into occupation duties. Leer was just one small town. Across Germany, millions of people were displaced, homeless, starving. The Nazi government had prioritized military supplies over civilian needs during the war's final year, leaving ordinary Germans with almost nothing. Now those same Germans were reaping what their leadership had sown, paying the price for a war they'd supported or at least enabled through their silence and compliance. The ethical questions were complex and uncomfortable. How much suffering did collective guilt justify? At what point did punishment become cruelty? Where was the line between holding a nation accountable and helping individual human beings who were in immediate need? Sullivan didn't have answers to these big philosophical questions. He just knew that when he looked at Anna and Heinrich and little Greta, he saw children who deserved to eat regardless of what adults had done. He knew that Margaret reminded him of his own mother, that universal quality of mothers everywhere who would sacrifice anything for their children. And he knew that walking past suffering without helping made him feel like a coward, like he was betraying something fundamental about who he was and what he believed. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. Sullivan heard the news while on patrol, heard the cheering and celebrating from other units, heard church bells ringing in towns that still had functioning bells. He felt relief that the fighting was finished, that he'd survived, that he could start thinking about going home to Toronto and marry and normal life. But the celebration felt muted. The war might be over, but the suffering wasn't. German civilians were still starving. The destroyed towns were still destroyed. The orphans were still orphans. Victory had been achieved, but the hard work of building peace had barely begun. Sullivan visited Margaret and her children that evening after the surrender was announced. He brought extra food to mark the occasion, including chocolate and canned fruit, luxuries he'd traded favors to acquire. Margaret understood from his expression and gestures that something significant had happened. The war was over. Germany had lost. She cried when she understood, though Sullivan couldn't tell if the tears were from relief or grief or some complex mixture of both. The war ending meant her husband would never come home, that hope was finally and definitely extinguished. But it also meant her children would grow up without bombs falling and armies fighting. It meant survival might be possible again. In the weeks after the surrender, Allied relief efforts slowly began to reach German civilians. Food distribution centers opened, medical clinics were established, displaced persons camps were set up to house refugees and homeless families. The bureaucracy ground into motion, slow and inefficient, but at least trying to address the humanitarian crisis. Margaret and her children were registered for assistance. They were given ration cards that entitled them to daily food allotments. It wasn't much, but it was more than they'd had before, more than they could acquire through scavenging and the charity of kind soldiers. Sullivan's unit received orders to move out in mid-June, redeploying to different occupation duties in another sector. He visited Margaret one last time before leaving. Through gestures and the few words they'd taught each other, he tried to explain that he was going away, that he wouldn't be able to visit anymore. Margaret understood. She hugged him, this enemy soldier who'd fed her children when they were starving, who'd fixed her roof and brought them blankets and treated them like human beings worthy of kindness. She was crying again, trying to say, "Thank you" in English, the pronunciation terrible, but the meaning clear. The children hugged him too. Anna gave him a drawing she'd made on a scrap of paper using a pencil he'd brought her, a picture of their family, and a tall figure in a Canadian uniform standing next to them. Heinrich shook his hand solemnly, trying to be grown up and brave. Little Greta gave him her stuffed rabbit, pressing it into his hands even though Sullivan tried to refuse, knowing it was probably her only toy. But she insisted, wanting to give him something in return for everything he'd given them. Sullivan left the damaged shop with the stuffed rabbit in his pack and tears in his eyes. He'd never see these people again. He knew that. They'd been thrown together by war and circumstance, had formed a connection that transcended the enemy labels imposed by governments and armies, and now they were being separated by those same forces. It was one small story in a war full of millions of stories, one brief encounter between enemies who'd discovered their common humanity. In the grand historical narrative of World War II, this moment would never be recorded or remembered, but for Sullivan and for Margaret and her children, it mattered enormously. Sullivan returned to Canada in September 1945, landing in Halifax and taking the train west to Toronto, watching the familiar landscape roll past the windows and feeling the strange disconnection of someone returning to a place they'd left, but that had continued existing without them. Toronto looked exactly the same as it had when he'd left in 1943, the same buildings and streets and neighborhoods, as if the war had happened somewhere else entirely and hadn't touched his hometown at all. But Sullivan had changed. He'd seen things and done things that separated him from the civilians who'd stayed home, experiences that couldn't be explained or shared with people who hadn't been there. He married Mary in November 1945, A quiet ceremony with family and a few friends, most of them veterans who understood the silences and the reluctance to talk about the war that characterized so many returning soldiers. Sullivan went back to work at his uncle's hardware store, slipping into the routine of peacetime life, selling hammers and nails and paint to customers who complained about rationing and shortages without understanding what real shortage meant. He didn't talk much about Germany or the occupation or the war. When people asked what it had been like, he'd give vague answers about the weather and the training and avoid the real questions underneath their questions. But he kept the stuffed rabbit. It sat on a shelf in his bedroom, a tangible reminder of 3 children he'd helped and a mother who'd been willing to beg an enemy soldier for food to keep her family alive. Mary asked about it once, and Sullivan had told her the story haltingly, struggling to find words for emotions that were too complex for simple narrative. Mary had listened quietly and then said something Sullivan never forgot. "You did the right thing," she said. "Whatever the rules were, whatever you were supposed to do, you did the right thing. That's what matters." Sullivan had children of his own over the following years, 3 sons born in 1946, 1948, and 1951. He'd watch them play and eat dinner and fight with each other over toys, and sometimes he'd think about Anna and Heinrich and Greta, wondering what had happened to them, whether they'd survived the difficult post-war years, whether they'd grown up and had children of their own. He'd never know. There was no way to find out. Germany was behind the Iron Curtain now, the Soviet zone inaccessible to Westerners. Even if he'd wanted to search for Margaret and her family, it would have been impossible. But in 1973, something extraordinary happened. Sullivan received a letter at his home in Toronto, forwarded through military channels and Canadian government offices, a letter that had traveled a complicated route from East Germany to Canada. The envelope was thin and worn, the stamps foreign. Inside was a single piece of paper covered in careful English writing, the grammar imperfect, but the message clear. "Dear Michael Sullivan," the letter began. "My name is Anna Weber. You know me when I was Anna Hoffman, small girl in Lear, 1945. I write to say thank you for your kindness to my mother and my brother and sister and me. You save our lives when we were starving. You give food and blankets and fix our roof. You treat us with respect when you could treat us with hate. My mother died last year, but before she died, she told me I must find you and tell you how much your kindness mean to us. Because of you, we survive. Because of you, I grow up and have children. Because of you, my brother become teacher like our father. Because of you, my sister live happy life. We never forget what you do. Thank you. Forever, thank you." Sullivan read the letter 3 times, tears running down his face, his hands shaking. Mary found him sitting at the kitchen table staring at the paper, and he showed it to her without speaking. She read it and started crying too, understanding what it meant to him, this confirmation that his choice to help had mattered, that those children had survived and grown up and remembered. The letter was the only one Anna would be able to send. East Germany didn't allow much communication with the West, but she'd found a way to send this one message across the decades and the barriers, to tell a Canadian soldier that his kindness had echoed through the years. Sullivan kept that letter until he died in 1996, kept it in the drawer of his bedside table next to the stuffed rabbit that had lost most of its fur and had been repaired dozens of times, but that he'd never thrown away. His sons found both items when they were going through his possessions after his death, and the oldest son remembered the story his father had told him years before about helping a German family during the occupation. The son contacted military historians and veterans organizations, trying to find more information about his father's service and the family he'd helped. The story eventually found its way into small articles in Canadian military history journals, one of those minor footnotes about individual acts of kindness during war. Some historians used it as an example of how Canadian soldiers had generally treated German civilians with more humanity than official policy suggested. Others saw it as evidence of the moral complexity of occupation, where soldiers had to navigate between following orders and following conscience. But for the people directly involved, it had been much simpler. A soldier had seen a mother and her starving children and had chosen to help. A mother had asked an enemy for food and had received not just food but kindness and dignity. 2 families separated by nationality and circumstance had connected through the universal languages of hunger and compassion and the desire to protect children. The broader truth revealed by Sullivan's story is that war creates countless small moments where individuals must choose between following rules and following their moral compass. Most soldiers in most wars face these moments at some point. Some choose rules, some choose conscience. Most navigate some complicated middle ground. Sullivan had chosen to help, and that choice had rippled forward through decades, affecting not just Margaret and her 3 children, but their children and grandchildren. People who existed because Sullivan had given food to a starving family in a ruined German town in April of 1945. The story also reveals something about the nature of kindness in wartime. Acts of mercy and compassion during war are often hidden, done quietly without official sanction or recognition, individual choices that don't make it into after-action reports or commendation recommendations. They happen in the spaces between official policy and human reality, when soldiers look at other human beings and decide that shared humanity matters more than enemy labels. Sullivan wasn't unique in this. Thousands of Allied soldiers made similar choices throughout the occupation of Germany. But each choice mattered to the specific people it affected. Each small act of kindness made a difference to someone who desperately needed help. In the end, what mattered most wasn't the historical significance of Sullivan's actions or their broader implications for understanding wartime morality. What mattered was that 3 children had eaten when they were starving, that a mother had received help when she was desperate, and that a young Canadian soldier had chosen kindness when he could have chosen indifference. The stuffed rabbit and the letter were physical artifacts of that choice, tangible reminders that even in war, even between enemies, moments of genuine human connection were possible. Those moments didn't undo the horror of war or erase the suffering it caused, but they proved that compassion could survive even in conditions designed to destroy it, that individuals could choose to be decent even when systems encouraged cruelty, and that sometimes the most important battles weren't fought with weapons, but with small acts of kindness that echoed across decades and continents and lives.